Palantir. 25% of Palantir Korea has just been purchased by a company in South Korea called HD Hyundai. And excuse me if I'm saying it wrong. HD Hyundai acquires a 25% stake in Palantir Korea. Now, they have entered the AI business by securing a stake in the Korean subsidiary of Palantir, which provides public sector AI services to U.S. intelligence services agencies and the military. South Korea and the United States have a very good relationship, very strong allies. Palantir is integrated very deeply in Japan and South Korea. So it's actually really nice to see a business in Korea. Now, this is the HHI Heavy Industries, Hyundai Heavy Industries. HHI was a company that partnered with Palantir to do shipping and manufacturing logistics. This is a $45 million contract that Palantir got last year. So Palantir is no stranger to the Korean markets and working with Korea. It's nice to see them secure a 25% stake in the company. The new joint venture will introduce and provide customized big data platform services to public and private sectors in Korea. HD Hyundai will be responsible for establishing a foothold in the Korean market and devising an entry strategy. Palantir will build and run big data platforms and also provide its software to its customers. Now, why is this important? BP, we saw last week, did an interview with Palantir. There's Peter Thiel, and I believe this is the chief president of HD Hyundai. Peter Thiel, obviously, the co-founder of Palantir. BP did an interview last week where they talked about how Palantir was so crucial for the company. It was so valuable. It was so important for the company that they ended up buying 1% of Palantir. They paid $431 million. Now they have liquidated that stake in the company, but they bought 1% of them in August 2021, I believe, because it was just that valuable for them to own the company. So when the company is so good, when the product is so important, when the analytics and data platform that they're able to provide is so different than what else has been seen on the market, that you decide to literally buy 25% of the company because you're like, not only do I want to use their services, I want to make sure that I own a portal into their equity. I own a world in the upside that I can participate in because I believe this company is going to have massive upside because I've seen what they've been able to do for my business. That's when you know that it's very exciting, right? That's when you know that you've got something that's interesting. And that's why I think it's an interesting thing that HD Hyundai decided to be like, hey, we're just going to acquire an entire 25% stake in Palantir. Now, this also comes right after an interview that I didn't get to see. Apparently, this dropped 10 days ago, but I really never got a chance to see it. I want to go through a little bit of it with Palantir's Alex Karp in Lobs. This is a written interview. It's not a video interview. So I want to go through a couple of questions that were asked and then go through some of the things that Karp said. So Palantir is an American company that is close to the CIA and specializes in big data analysis. What does France represent for Palantir? And I believe this was a French news outlet, which is why they're asking about France. Karp says, our first two markets are the United States and Great Britain, and then France is on par with Germany, but Paris is our main office in the European Union. Its role is very important because it is our base for us to develop the rest of the continent. It represents significant revenue and a strategic mission. Besides that, they have many people who are successful at Palantir have one thing in common. They speak French. Next question. Just before you had a meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky in June 2022, you mentioned that the risk of nuclear conflict was greater than we think. Why? I said that at a time when Americans thought there was zero risk. At the time, we weren't allowed to talk about it, but in this conflict, the Ukrainians are successfully using our software against the Russian army. Building Palantir over the past 20 years, I've seen how companies, secret services, and terrorists underestimate the power of software. When one side, Ukraine, uses heroism and agility alongside our platform, they can beat the other side, Russia, who weren't expecting it, and that's the case. It can become very dangerous because Vladimir Putin reasons in terms of a zero-sum game. He's convinced that the victory for the Ukrainians would be a loss for Russia, which is quite foreign to the American way of thinking. And he's absolutely correct about that. I mean, we still don't know how Putin is going to take this news about Ukraine potentially winning. This is why we have Xi Jinping now in Russia and, having the little tea party with Putin trying to figure out a solution to this conflict and brokering a peace deal. But, I think Putin's still not smart enough. I think he's too smart to launch a nuclear weapon, but it's not like he hasn't thought about it before, especially if he thinks that he's losing because he's an irrational dictator. Let's go to some of these other questions. How many governments are using your platform in Europe? Karp says, it took us 5 to 6 years to build this tool and another 5 years to systematize it. This is why our product is a hit in Europe. Although the one client that we have the right to name is Denmark, I can tell you that our platform is really used massively in Europe. It is easier to identify countries that do not use us. That is interesting. So we don't have an exact number of how many governments are using Palantir in Europe. We know that Lithuania, Poland, obviously the UK, Germany, France, Denmark. All of these companies or all of these countries are using Palantir. But if he says it's easier to identify countries that do not use it, that's not a bad sign. Now, the problem is governmental growth has not increased in Europe as much as it has, and Palantir has been even, honest about the fact that governmental growth has not gone up. So let's hope that government growth, even though the platform is being used in Europe, it's being used in more places in Europe and in more subsidiaries of different forms of the government in European governments, because that would lead to some more growth, because that just hasn't been happening over the past quarter. Let's take a look at this question. In the past, Palantir has been accused by the American left of having provided the tools to authorities to track down illegal immigrants, of having helped the government to protect itself from WikiLeaks, or having been involved in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Are these controversies behind you today? Karp's response: the immigration affair in the United States has been completely politicized. Even in Japan, which hardly accepts any immigrants, I've been asked questions about it. That said, the controversy does not bother me. It is normal that these debates are continuing because Palantir has played a central role in the most important issues affecting Western democracies over the last 10 years, preventing the takeover of the far right in France and elsewhere, which is linked to the resolution of terrorism, saving lives during the pandemic, preventing or counting territorial invasions in Eastern Europe, mainly in Ukraine. And I think our role will be even more important over the next 10 years. Look, I think this is the best answer you can give to someone who criticizes the company of being too far to the right, quote unquote, and like hurting leftist causes. Because at the end of the day, they are trying to protect Western democracy. And protecting Western democracy, people think it's like this horrible thing to say, but it's actually one of the best things you can do, because Western democracy is better than pretty much every other system that exists. And that's coming from someone who lives in a Western democracy, but also it's objectively true. It's just better than communism, right? So at the end of the day, if that's the mission you're standing up for, there might be gray spots in between that. But if that's the overarching mission, then that's something good to try to live up to. The problem is also the way in which your customers use your monitoring tool. They say it can be used in an unethical way, as we saw in the Israeli spyware Pegasus. Karp says the question is a relevant one, but over a 20-year period, we weren't all that wrong about it. We have never sold anything to Chinese or Russian institutions. It makes a lot of sense now, but didn't make sense 15 years ago. And again, it makes a lot of sense. That's where Chinese investors and Russian investors wanted to get in on the company. That's where other investors were pressuring them to sell to China and Russia, but they said, nope, it's too powerful. We're not going to sell it to them. But you still sell to countries with little respect for human rights like Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Karp says, we sell to certain countries in the Middle East. They have their own code of ethics, which is not exactly the same as ours. There is no perfect answer. We've turned down some big contracts due to ethical reasons, and I'm proud of that. But when I explain this to my investor, they ask the board why I'm still the CEO. That said, the problem is a complex one. For example, if we sell to the French state, is it legitimate? But what happens if Marine Le Pen comes to power? So this is an interesting thing, right? Because yes, countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia don't have that much respect for human rights. And Karp kind of gives a cop-out answer by saying, look, they have different perspectives than us, which is why, we can't necessarily challenge their ethical frameworks. One could argue China and Russia also have totally different perspectives, which is why you shouldn't challenge their ethical framework. I would argue that China and Russia go a step beyond some of the countries in the Middle East in terms of, yes, maybe they're not all democracies, but China and Russia are proving themselves to be absolutely insane dictatorships, to the point where you can objectively argue they're a degree worse than some of these other companies or countries. And then, Karp is saying, if we sell to the French state, it is legitimate, which is good. But if you have some far right figures come to power, is it still legitimate to sell to the French state? And that's where you get into all these ethical questions that are really, really hard to deal with. And I think no company can manage these questions effectively. Not oil companies, not social media companies, really very few companies. And you need to have some objective guidelines like Russia invading Ukraine, which is why all companies start to leave and exit Russia, which even though it's going to hurt their bottom line, they know it's the right thing to do. So there's never a perfect answer to this, but if you can at least make the best answer with the tools available, that's probably the best way that you want to do this. Okay, last question we'll go through. On these types of questions, Peter Thiel and the other co-founder of Palantir, you are politically apart. Whose views prevail? This is a common question that people ask, because Karp and Thiel is a libertarian, Karp is a self-described socialist. Peter and I are close friends, and I don't have many of those. Moreover, his political ideas are more complex than what people say, especially on human rights. He's been very effective chairman for 20 years, and I run the company. We have lively discussions on every subject. Unlike him, I think Trump is an abomination. Besides, I warned Hillary Clinton's collaborators during his campaign that he might win, but they thought I was crazy. That said, even before these sorts of dilemmas reach me or Peter, I've had Palantirians yelling at me, we can't do this, and sometimes I agree with them. I made a really interesting video back in 2022 called The Paradoxical Relationship Between Alex Karp and Peter Thiel. I would recommend checking that out if you just type that into YouTube, because I did a really, really big deep dive on why the socialist and libertarian philosophy that are intertwined within each other actually results in the best business because of their disagreements. And so if you want to see kind of my take on how they disagree and why they disagree, you can check out why I think that them disagreeing is ultimately a good thing. But this was the new CARP interview. South Korea getting and HD Hyundai getting a 25.1% stake in Palantir, and Palantir's latest interview with Alex Karp. I'll link the interview in the description of this video. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you think about Karp's answers. And yeah, brand new CARP interview. Thank you all for listening and watching. I'll see you in the next one.